Welcome to KIMEcast, where we break through and cut the BS in sports medicine, rehabilitation, and sports performance, and talk about how things really work. Welcome to KIMEcast. Tony Mikla, Russ Duncan. We got a new look, a little bit of a new vibe today, so this is kind of cool, something different, new chairs. See how it goes. See if it gets Russ going.
Yeah, I don't know, too comfortable. We'll see.
If it inspires
I'll have to. You might get a yawn.
Yeah, you might get sleepy over there. Could be something. All right, let's talk a little about movement. I think we were talking about some great stuff. I know I got a chance to work with Stu McMillan for several years. Just phenomenal speed coach, and he's put some stuff out there that was a kind of newer language than I've heard him use in the past on this kineogram.
Yeah, the kinogram, KINO.
Right,
kinogram.
He's done a good job on naming that. I think that concept is that you're looking at an athlete, you're looking at a person move or an athlete move, and you're assuming that they're getting to certain shapes. And this is something that I've presented on for years. Like we did this a lot at Rock Tape. So at Rock Tape, we were looking to after all of the evolution of these different things with tape and different things. Obviously, it was a company moving towards helping people move better, and we put together the movement course towards the end of the big education run with Rock Tape over the last probably 5-6 years ago. We developed a movement course that really was based on this idea of shape. Mm-hmm. And it was something that we created with Steve, where I was giving them ideas of when people move, they assume shapes. And that's probably the best way you can move forward from a gold standard standpoint as to what is someone's ability. If you look at it, can they get into the shape? Then the question is, can they own the shape? Mm-hmm. Do they have control within the shape? Can they get into it? Is it easy? Can they have control within that shape? And then there's the second question is, once they can do that, can they then generate power out of that shape? Can they be explosive and generate force and do something from that position? Mm-hmm. So one thing, can they get into and own it? Two things, can they do something from it? So that was kind of the premise that we kind of built out, mostly because we were able to simplify and kind of dumb down the movement analysis thought process. That's kind of what we end up with. And I think that's what Stu's done here.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, establishing the kineogram is looking at something fast, like a sprint, and identifying 5 different snapshots of time: toe off, strike, heel land, stance, maximal vertical projection. So he's got a 5 different list of what he looks for with a sprint technique. You could do the same thing for a cut, for a jump, for a throw, and anything really ballistic and athletic that's repeated over and over in sport and fitness and fast ballistic movement, powerful movement. Can you wrap a framework around it so that the words are meaningful? This frame, we call this frame this thing. And then, if you say, well, maximal vertical projection of a full sprint might look like this. And maybe you have some averages. We see the shin angle look like this, the thigh angle look like this, the trunk angle look like this. And then when you are able to kind of create that construct, then you can have an idea of what's quote unquote normal, what's outside of normal. Is that healthy? Is that pathological? If your shin angle is pointing backwards upon your heel down with a run, mm-hmm. is that more likely to give you shin splints and hamstring strains and forces on the back that are excessive with braking?
Right.
Yeah. So that idea.
Yeah, I think it is really, really good. So if you think, what I would suggest that people do is they look at whatever sport they're playing, or if they're, if you're a coach or a PT working with an athlete, think about what sport the athlete's participating in. And then this is where I think you need to take screenshots, you need to take slow motion video, take shots, and look at the athlete in certain positions. If you're throwing something, there's kind of a power position they have to get into. With the front leg strided forward, the hips have opened up, and then you're looking to see that there's a rotational torque where the hips are going one direction and the shoulders are still facing the other one. And you've achieved this kind of 90-degree torque in the body. We call it the power position in rotational athletics. So if you can see that, and then see what the athlete's doing. And then I do think there's an ideal, maybe an ideal template to work from, or a framework to work from, where it's this is what good people do. you have to realize there's some error there. That not every person can do it the same way. That's actually healthy and that's normal. But you can kind of see some framework. It's like, all right, these are some of the critical things. These are pretty close. And then you look at what this athlete do that you're coaching and say, okay, what position are you getting into? And then what position do you want them to get into? What's the difference between those two shapes? And then you start putting together movements, exercises, coaching cues that would facilitate that progression. And then you just bring that down. You make it simpler and simpler and simpler, depending on like if the end movement is sprinting, which I think is the end movement for all athletes. Like at the very least, sprinting has to be on the docket. So then you need to break down, okay, what does sprinting look like, as you just stated in these different phases: toe off, heel contact or foot contact underneath the body. What's the arm action look like, et cetera. All these things make shapes. They require certain body parts to move a certain way, and then they require certain muscle function to accomplish that. So once you break that down, you say, okay, this is what the athlete needs to be able to get to. Then you look at what they're doing now, and then you bridge that gap. So if the person's in rehab and they can't, bend their knee past 90 degrees, but a full sprint requires them to bend their knee 130 degrees, well, then you have to attain it, right? So you work on attaining that range of motion. And then you have to understand that motion is mostly achieved passively. It's not achieved as actively, like through active hamstring contraction. A majority of that motion is achieved just by gravity and by the speed of which the person flexes their hip. So the harder they flex the hip, the faster the foot comes up underneath them. So shouldn't be, the exercise that would be mistaken here would be to do like a bunch of hamstring curls to try to improve knee flexion, speed, and sprinting. It's not a terrible idea, but it's probably not going to get you there as fast as doing hip flexor work or work that's going to do a better job of driving the knee and thigh forward, because the faster you do that, then you have just circumferential force that's going to come and bring that heel to the butt.
I think it's really essential as when you look at a kinegram of the body and breaking it down in different movements, and how are we able to achieve these movements ballistically. And it is through very ballistic contractions of certain muscles that then stretch the body. And then that stretch creates energy storage. That's what connective tissue does. Tendons and fascia store energy. It's really important to understand that. So if you look at the mechanics of collagen will stretch anywhere from 4 to 10%. In other words, if you stretch collagen, a tendon structure, 10% more than its original length, it will plastically deform, i.e. tear. So how do we not tear? We have to coach all tendinous, collagenous tissues in the body to have a good, healthy stretch and store energy and then release it quickly. So we do need freedom of the body, and then we need to figure out how to move ballistically that then delivers a very good stretch to the system, and then that stretch recoils, much like a bow and arrow, done very quick. So you give a quick stretch to the bow, you get a release, and you store that stored energy then releases, and the body recoils into the next pattern. And understanding that gives you an appreciation of how we're able to tolerate these extreme movements, even though if you ask someone to put their heel to their butt with their knee vertical, they'll cramp. They're hamstring cramps. They can't sustain that position. Yep. But if you see it with speed, they're able to do it beautifully, no problem.
Yes. I think that's one of the biggest mistakes we see in like types of training is people see, oh, the heel got to the butt, it's got to be a hamstring moment. It might be mildly, but it's not an aggressive hamstring moment. That force is generated by something else moving. So even though you're looking at a picture, looking at an image, when you look at these shapes, you do have to ask that consideration. It's like, what's the shape? Can they get into the shape first and foremost? And then secondly, like what creates that shape? Is it speed? Is it gravity? Is it angular velocity? Is it force production? How do they get where they get? And then you want to make sure you train that variable.
That's right, because a lot of these strains that occur or difficulties that occur is the muscle is not very good when it's very long. And when it's very long, going back to that heel to the butt position, when the thighs, a little bit more pointed down, if not touched forward, that position would cramp a lot of hamstrings, but it's actually a pretty intense stretch through your anterior line. And if you're not strong through said quad and hip flexor tissue in a long position, you'll have a hard time violently contracting and pulling your knee through. But the body's smart. I think the body's insanely smart. So when we see bad shapes to make, I think we're seeing the governor in your central nervous system. just like, old school cars that had a governor that didn't allow you to go past 140 miles an hour because the engine would blow. Well, I think that's a key attribute and a very important safety attribute of the central nervous system. If you don't have good tolerance or strength or control in these long positions, the body will have a hard time getting there and it'll make these awkward shapes. It's not going to allow you to get into more of a quote unquote normal shape if you have a weak segment or an unstable segment. And if by chance you're able to supercharge that and get through an area that you're unstable or weak in, well, then the body falls apart as it should, and you strain or you endure instability injuries. Yeah. So I think it's a very important system, a governor.
Yeah, I think you're right. To add to that point, this idea of that same position, heel to butt, thighs pointed down, it requires a tremendous amount of length on the anterior line. So what if you don't have the length, then a few things can happen. One, you're not going to get as much heel kick up to the glute, right? So you're not going to get the heel to come to the butt. The reason that's important is because it's going to slow down the speed at which you can bring that foot through into the forward part of the stride. So that slows down the stride speed, so it makes you slower. The other option the body has is if you can't get your heel to your butt, it could hyperextend the anterior thigh a little bit. It could extend the hip a little bit greater, which when that happens, it's going to pull the spine to a little bit more of a rotation and move the pelvis from the bottom up. So that may not be a huge factor, it may not look like a very big deal, but when you have the pelvis being torqued by the thoracic spine rotating the opposite direction, because the arms are driving in equally as strong of a way in the opposite direction, you've created this massive amount of torque on one spot. Now, that torque should be disassociated over a large number of vertebrae. So if it's just focused down to one, the hip extends a little bit, puts it on the posterior, like on the SI region, or maybe on the L5, S1 facet. When you get that kind of force on it, then you get too much force over one spot and you see the problems. So this is where the control comes in. Can you get into the position of hip extension with the knee straight down, heel to the butt, when have control of it? Or can you only get into it with velocity and with force, and then therefore maybe it's uncontrolled, and therefore maybe you have these hypermobility problems where you get some joint breakdown or you get some irritation forming. So these are, it's complicated, but at the same time, if you break it down to like, can they get into the shape? And if it's a yes or no answer. So for example, we use the bretzel a lot to do the same concept. Mm-hmm. So if we're talking about sprinting, so take a sprinter, and in standing, you know they have to get the heel of the butt and swing that leg through, like we just talked about. If we put them in a bretzel position, lay them on the ground, can they get there? And is it easy? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. And then when they're there, where's the tension? We just did this in the clinic 3 hours ago. This person was doing a movement. They're like, that hurts. And I think one of the biggest missed questions that we can ask, I see this in younger therapists especially, they don't ask where. Mm-hmm. Like, so where does it hurt and what are you feeling exactly? Because people say it hurts. Does that mean it's hard? Mm-hmm. Does that mean that it's like sharp pain? Does that mean that there's stretching tension? Like, what are we dealing with? Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. So in observing this, we didn't get that piece of information from the patient. We just got, it hurts. So then usually the correlates to like, I don't want to do it anymore. I'm going to stop. Mm-hmm. Where it's like, well, if it hurts and it's stretching, and the movement that you're doing is safe and all that, but it's also required to move down the path, then quitting it's not exactly the right end. That's not what we wanted to accomplish there. So we probably should have got back into that and owned that a little bit more. But nonetheless, let's say you put them in a bretzel position on the sideline position, so they're unloaded. Can they get into it easily? And then if they can get into it easily, great. Now they can get in the position, perfect. Now the question is, can they own it? So can they do it in like a split stance and have them hold it for a long period of time? So we do a 1 minute hold in like a split stance position. Can they own it? Can they control that space that they're in? And then the next question would be, can they create power from that position? Can they jump out of it? So they could do a split stance, split jump, plyometric work, and then can they land and then reload and jump again? Mm-hmm. So can we test them in these positions that are necessary, these shapes that are necessary? And I think it's critical to not only go through the testing, but then also ask, where are the areas of difficulty?
Yeah, in our performance continuum of looking at, is the motion painful? Is the motion free and available? Is the motion appropriately stable so that you can put pressure on that system and the person can withstand gravity, withstand a load for said time, 15, 30, 60 seconds? Then is the person strong out of that position? Can you put a kettlebell in their hand, they can go in and out of the position? And then can they generate ballistic force and be fast in and out of that pattern. And when you're able to take a simple shape and go from a nearly pain-free position to a free movement, to a stable and coordinated pathway that you can get stronger and then more ballistic, this is a very surefire way to help the shape, to fortify the shape. So when the athlete makes that shape or some variation of that shape, their body's going to have confidence, going to have capacity. The muscles have seen that, the joint has seen it, the collagen has seen it, and if they've seen it and they've expressed it, I think that's such a cool word I learned from a scientist. Gene expression. Can you express the gene in that position? And if maybe it's more of a collagenous expression because you're withholding it for 60 seconds. Or maybe it's a mitochondrial expression because you did it 50 times inside of 3 minutes. So we need expression there, and that helps build capacity at every cellular level of how is the mitochondrial powerhouse working? Is the collagen tolerating stress? Is the nervous system coordinating it very well? And if you can nail those three, energy, nervous system coordination and strength, and collagenous, tendinous, connective tissue tolerance. If you can nail those three, that fixes a lot of things.
Yeah, tell me more about that. This idea of gene expression, because I think it's an interesting concept, and the language is weird. Because for me, it's not super clear to me. So, the idea of gene expression would be that the body is using that gene or using that tissue to its more of its potential, versus like you have the gene, you're just not really utilizing it.
Yeah, so there's so if you want more mitochondrial density because you want more stamina in that position, you want to be able to repeat load over and over with good energy. Then you want to take every cell in the body might have a certain amount of mitochondria. So say like 200 or 300 units of that organelle of mitochondria. And if you want more mitochondria because you want more stamina, because you want more capacity in that tissue, you need to express the gene that gives you more mitochondria. That means you need to work in a way that challenges stamina repeatedly over and over and over to turn 200 mitochondria into 800 mitochondria. And that'd be like a 4x difference in your aerobic potential, which means you could repeat loads and the tissue would recover aerobically. Because if it doesn't recover aerobically, it will start lacking strength, since strength needs ATP to function. And once you lack strength, then you strain. So you're looking at what type of gene do you want to express? Is it a collagen gene to make the tissue stronger with a stretch? If it's a mitochondrial gene, it's more stamina under pressure. If it's a neurological gene expression, you're trying to take a county road type approach from your brain to your quadricep. Is it a county road where all the cars are driving 25 miles an hour, or is it a 6-lane freeway, in Los Angeles that people are still going very slow, so that's a really bad example. But you get my point.
They do drive slower now. Yeah. I would agree with that.
Yeah. So are we turning a county road into a freeway? And that's a neurological gene expression because the nervous system loves myelin. The myelin is the fatty acid tissue that surrounds every nerve. And when you synergistically hit something very ballistically, think like speed and power work, and then you would increase that speed power work once a week for 8 weeks in a row, and you improved your power by 25%. What happened? Well, a lot of things happened. You probably learned how to activate more muscle cells, and you also learned how to activate them quicker. So that would be improved sheath around the nervous system, as well as you activating literally more peripheral nerves from that one command in your central nervous system. So the expression of the gene would be, what would be the change? What cell is changing with your program design? Now, I don't think the athlete needs to know this unless they have a pretty deep understanding of science. But the clinician has to know, do I want the tendon to change? Do I want the nervous system to change? Do I want the muscle to change? Is it the slow twitch or the fast twitch? Do I need more heart? Do I need more cardiac load? And so the gene expression idea is really just like, I want that area to be better. And let's express it. And so that then people say, should I do this every day or twice a week? Or, I don't have time. I'll do it next week because I don't have time right now. Like, first off, one workout's better than no workout, and let's work on daily if it's low threat, and then the higher the threat, the less the frequency. So we can really overcomplicate programming, and to be honest, you could probably argue along with Stu McMillan will say, everyone's different. Yes, let's learn what people adapt to, but let's start expressing genes on day one. Let's go. Let's load it. But you have to ask, what's the tissue?
Yeah. Well, yeah. What's the shape that we're talking about? What's the shape of the body that we have to get into? And then what's the limiting factor? Is it a mobility problem? Is it a strength problem? Is it a power problem? And then based on that, if it's a power problem, is it a tendon compliance issue, or is it a muscle reactivity issue, or is it a muscle recruitment issue? What are those factors? And then I think the programming should be specific to that. If we're actually doing it, if you're doing it individually in a professional, like elite way, then that's where you want to get to. And I think that's really important. I think that we have a very unique position to be able to do that in the world. And I think a lot of people look at programming and they think of what they see with teams or what they see in college as like great programming. And it is great programming, but they're programming it because they're doing with large groups still to like the average or maybe the lowest common denominator, as people say, but I don't think that's necessarily true, but maybe to the middle somewhere. But they're definitely not taking the elites and making them just 10% better. They're making the majority of the group better, and the elites might find it quite easily and quite boring, actually. And there's people below that simply can't do the stuff. They can't even get into the shape, so then they end up trying to get into the shape because everybody else is doing it, and they hurt themselves because they're in a mobility category. You're training a strength category, and then the guys who can create great strength and have amazing power, are getting bored. So it's
absolutely, and I think the movement sector has so much. I don't want to use the word creativity, but that's the biggest opportunity I think for most of us as a clinician to help people improve, because you rarely meet a perfect mover. Not unless they somehow did gymnastics on Monday, dance on Tuesday, soccer on Wednesday, they threw something like a baseball on Thursday. Like, who does that? So, because we have habitual postures and we play a particular sport that forces a lot of habitual posturing as well, we all kind of have these issues, so to speak. And those issues create tightness of the joint, tightness in the fascia that might be one side more so than the other. And some of that you might say it's adaptive and it might be a good thing. I think most of the time it's not a great thing. And strength and conditioning and physical therapy are these opportunities to help improve motion back to a free state and a healthy state. Because I think sports don't care how healthy you're going to be after the game. They don't care. It's you're going to move in all the crazy ways you're going to move, and you're going to suffer from it unless you know how to appropriately recover and reestablish good motion. And that's the opportunity for S&C and good PT, is to get very niche, very focused and say, it's this right ankle, it's this left hip, it's this flexion rotation in your spine that is a bit off. And for you to squeeze out that 10% of improvement on performance or heal from an injury, you have to normalize that. And that's why we have to get very granular in our profession, but we also have to zoom out and understand what is the type of person, what shapes they make, and where are the areas of improvement.
Yeah. No, it's huge. And you should see this. Like when if you've watched Tom Brady, or is it probably the best example was Tom, but there's other guys that have been really popularized their workouts, like Patrick Mahomes as well. You see that their workouts are very, very, very skill-based, very kind of specific neurological type of training in the weight room, not necessarily on the field, but in the weight room as well. And they're not pounding their body with a lot of load or a lot of things because they're working towards their limiting factor. Patrick already is incredibly strong. You could probably debate whether Tom is strong or not, but he definitely has a frame and a body, and his style of play is such that he had the tools to play at that level and do that. But he needed to develop just certain things and very specific things, so he'd work on more of those. And him staying healthy was the most important thing for the team. Now, if you're training like a 14-year-old or like a 12-year-old, their limiting factor is probably not that one specific skill or being able to like really do a certain thing with their shoulder or a certain thing with a band or a certain thing with their feet. Although those are factors, the limiting factor is probably that they're 50 pounds less than what they're going to weigh in 5 years. maybe 80 or 100 pounds less than what they're going to weigh in 5 years. They probably have decent movement. Like they probably have the ability to get into any shape you want to, but they can't control anything. They can barely stand on one leg. They certainly can't do a pistol squat on one side. You know, they don't have control. And so what we see in sports typically or in training is that, well, we just play really fast, powerful things. So they're out playing soccer or they're playing baseball or they're playing basketball. They're just going fast and hard all the time, which is power type movements with a little bit of conditioning. And then if they do get in the weight room, it's then very traditional, kind of like, well, let's load it and get your body strong type of stuff. So they end up with all of this, you know, if they do get stronger and actually get in the weight room, they're doing squats and deadlifts and, you know, they eventually get to power cleans, things like that as they get into their teenage years. But nobody's ever taken the time to work on the control element of can you own the shape and actually own it, right? You got into the shape. That's what allowed you to go to the next level and be good at the sport. But you didn't really control the shape, and that's where you should end up coming back and seeing us at some point, is that you got strong, you got powerful, you continued to get into the shapes and did really good things, but you never really controlled it very well, and that puts you at risk for injury. So I think it's key when you look at when you're training, you can't do all of it, and you shouldn't have to.
No.
You got to train to the limiting factor of who you're working with and what the age is. So look at the shape of what it is they need, look at who's in front of you, and then figure out what the limiting factor is.
Yeah, I got a great story of a pro pitcher that came to me with a hurt arm. He's one of the best organizations in the world, and he's a pitcher at the highest level and can throw extremely fast in the mid to high 90s. And he was still throwing that fast when I saw him. He was just doing it with a lot of pain. And he told me about an old knee issue that didn't hurt anymore. And then his first question was, "Do you think that's a factor?" I said, "Well, you throw 97 miles an hour. You had an old knee issue. I think it's a big factor." And I just tested him like, "Hey, a good throw off the mound is going to require your knee to at least bend 90 degrees. Some would argue probably more like 100 degrees of knee flexion. And then you got to ballistically come out of that position with a lot of power. If you don't have the juice in that knee, you're not going to assume that position. Your body is going to protect it and say only go to 70, 75, 80 degrees, but not 90, 95 degrees. It will protect you of that." And sure enough, I tested his quad, and his quad was 15% weaker than the other side. And a guy who's throwing that fast needs every element of the equation
That's a big difference.
to work. Yeah, it's like, this is of course the problem with your shoulder. We can do all the shoulder stuff, but you have a kinetic linking problem because your body's shortcutting. It's compensating around this. And so, you know, the best and biggest organization in the world failed to do something really simple. Let's just rebuild your knee. I did simple bodybuilding. I rubbed on his patellar tendon. I had him do some leg extensions, and we developed a really deep split squat over about 7 weeks. Tested, quad was good. Within 3 weeks, he was in spring training, throwing the mid-90s without any pain, which he hadn't done in 3 years. It was actually so simple to utilize the mindset of, you need to make this shape. If you don't make this shape, problems will arise downstream. And so we can call it compensation, we can call it kinetic linking, but it's just the body's making a shape and needs to ballistically move out of these positions. Can you do it? If you can't, that's the limiting factor. Yeah. All of this training didn't really matter until we got this one area strong. And unfortunately, if you just do heavy squats and lunges or power cleans, it's not going to address one focused area. And this is where, if you have an old bug, your knee hurt, your hip hurt, your back hurt, it creates naturally inhibition, which means you get a little weak in that area. And the body will stay weak until you expose that one thing. And it can't be a gross pattern because the body's too smart. It'll figure out how to compensate around it.
Absolutely. No, I love that story for several reasons. I mean, you have, here's a guy who's developed. He's obviously got a talent. He's got power. He's got strength. He's throwing at the ball that hard. It's special. But yet, he has a limiting factor that was away from the source, but part of this kinetic chain. So it's a huge find. You go after that source, you fix the limiting factor, and then then he puts it all back together very, very quickly. That's great. The other great thing about that is he guided it.
Yeah.
It was by you listening to say like, hey, like, what's going on here? And then he brought it up.
Yeah.
As like, hey, this might be part of the problem, or I'm not sure if it is or not, but it's something that makes sense to me, right? And I think that's so important that people, a lot of times, the patient always has the answer. And if you can ask the right questions and listen enough, a lot of times they'll tell you what it is.
Yeah.
They just can't organize it in their brain as to how that makes sense. But it seems that it's a factor.
Yeah, tell me the story of your body. Chapter 1. What have you done a lot of? What'd you do growing up? What positions are you in a lot? What has your body seen? Has it seen any significant injuries or trauma? What do you think?
I ask that question all the time to people, of athletes or not, especially as they've aged. Like, what were you good at some point? Like, what was your body really good at some point? Did you play soccer? Did you play baseball? Like, what did you do a lot of? Because it tells me how you developed it and trained it, and then those things are still going to be in there, and you're probably going to have some signs of wear and tear also in those patterns or shapes, because you did a lot, and maybe that's set you up for what you have now. Or my hope is to get a little something like, yeah, I used to do that, but then I got hurt doing it, so then I haven't moved since then, is also valuable, right? Because then you're taking like, all right, well, you used to do this all the time, and then you stopped because you got hurt, and then now 10 years later you're saying, well, then my back hurts, but you stopped moving 10 years ago. That was where that kind of goes wrong.
Yeah, and I think when you listen to the story, and maybe there was a pain pattern before, I think it's so critical to try and understand, maybe even just a little guess, as to which layer did the injury occur. And I think there's something to that. I do think the deepest layers of our body have the most long-standing wounds. They tend to ripple. What would be the most deep to your body? And the deepest things would be, the deep of your spine is clearly your nervous system, your brain and your central cord, and then coming out the peripheral nerves. And then also deep would be the articular cartilage in your bone. If your bone's not right, meaning brittle, I think it's a big problem. You might not be expressing good red blood cell generation, good stem cell proliferation, but also the articular cartilage, which is like the holy grail of movement. And so if we have a cartilage, bone, nervous system issue, those are very, very deep problems. And then the next layer is more doable, right? We got ligamentous tissue around the joint capsule and the ligaments themselves. And then obviously all the fascia and muscle tendon after that. But trying to figure out what layer kind of gives you an idea of how long is this going to take, how serious is this? You start adjusting like, oh, we're going to get 100% return, get you back to normal. Or like, oh, we're going to have to change some things about your life. When you have articular cartilage issues, fissuring and cracks and holes in your cartilage, these are lifestyle changes that need to occur.
Yeah. I think that's a great point. It's a great way to look at it, too, to break it down those kind of sections. And it brings it back. We talked with Sean Robinson on here about, when to do a total knee replacement. We talked about the ideas that when it starts affecting your lifestyle where you can't do the things you want to do, that probably becomes the time to consider it. And to that point, if something's wrong with the bone or something's wrong with the cartilage, where you can't get the knee into the shape that it's supposed to be anymore, and therefore you can't assume the other shapes you want to do in life, whether that be like what you need to do to hike, like lift your knee up to 90 degrees, step on a rock, be able to take a big stride. If you can't do those things anymore, and the limiting factor is the joint and not the soft tissues around it, no matter how strong you get the soft tissues, the joint still sucks because it's worn out and beat up, well then, replace the joint so that you can then keep the other tissues healthy, start to get back in those shapes and keep going.
Yes.
I think it's a massive concept. It's this idea of certainly shapes and then find the right limiting factor. I think that is such a huge thing too, is people have too much of a generalist view sometimes as far as like programming goes. You really want to program to that limiting factor and make sure you address it.
Well, I think it's so interesting at this like stage of how elite orthopedic surgery can be that, here we are talking sports medicine, shapes off of a kinegram, ballistic running, and then we talked about joint replacement. That's still in the same breath. Sports medicine and joint replacements are still in the same storyline here. I just had a world-class athlete that had a peri acetabular and femoral head resurfacing. Pretty, kind of like a joint replacement, but just a replacement of just that cartilaginous rim. Pretty crazy and intense therapy he did. It was a year-long rehab of a lot of work. But understanding when to pull the trigger on injection therapy to get an elite ortho involved is a big part of like sports medicine for athletes in their 30s and for aging athletes in their 40s and 50s. It's an interesting focus point, and the clinician, the physical therapist needs to be on board with understanding what the injections do, what are the surgical options, and how to navigate like, hey, we need to get someone elite on board for an intervention. You really have to know all the options here.
Yeah, couldn't agree more. I think that you have to have a team that you can go into and solve that problem. But identifying the limiting factor is the key element there. The other end of that spectrum to comment about would be the physical therapist's perspective and how it's kind of moved over the last 20 years, where if you're really manually oriented and you're thinking you're working on, joint mobilization of a spinal segment or a shoulder or a knee or something, and that's the limiting factor, that's great. That's not wrong. What I would encourage you highly is that what I've learned through working with a number of athletes, that when you have the right joint mobilization, the results are almost instant. Mm-hmm. So within 30 seconds to 2 minutes of doing some joint mobility work, that joint will do what it's supposed to do, if it's healthy. Mm-hmm. So if the articular cartilage is there, if the ligament structure is, whatever, if it's intact for the most part, and then you mobilize that joint, move it around, do what you need to do, get it to glide the way that it's supposed to, get it to do what you want it to do, it will instantly do it, and then you can transfer it, and it's pretty much behind you. Mm-hmm. If it won't do that, so if you're finding that you're spending more than that amount of time, 30 seconds to 2 minutes on a particular bony segment, on a joint segment, my suggestion would be that either the damage is further than what you can handle with your hands and further than you can change, or that's not the problem. And the problem is going to be more like soft tissue limitation or scar tissue or some sort of like built up tightness around the area, or the fact that it hasn't moved in many years. Those types of things would be bigger points. Mm-hmm. So I think be careful of that. If you find yourself doing a ton of manual work and either getting frustrated because it's not making progress, or maybe the progress is very, very small, you have to consider that there's other factors at play. That may not be the only limiting factor. Or if that's the limiting factor, then you might want to recommend they get further workup on the surgery front, go see the doc, see if there's something they can work through there to get that joint to be back in line, because that could be one factor. Or go in the direction of more soft tissues instead of the joint itself.
Yeah, and that's why you absolutely have to look at the other side. If they're a fairly adaptive athlete, like a thrower, rotational athlete, where they're going to have a very dominant side, then you have to appreciate the total arc. So if you look at the shoulder, the total arc of the shoulder for the dominant throwing arm should be the same as the non-dominant arm. Total arc. Maybe the external rotation and internal rotation specifics are going to be much different. For the hip athlete, like a soccer, lacrosse, football, it might be different if they have a particular cutting style. Say they're a jumper and they always jump and leap like a basketball athlete off of one leg. So you might see left to right disturbances in the hip, knee, and ankle, but less so. Definitely for the rotational athlete, less so for the multi-directional athlete. Unless you're running on a track like my oldest and you're always turning left like Zoolander. If you're always doing that, well, maybe they need to go backwards on a track. But my point is you need to look at left to right, but also look at the framework of what's the available motion isn't appropriate. And this is where we lean on different systems. I think Greg Cook's system is very good here. The functional movement systems have outlined, hey, this is a key important total arc, total range of motion about the tibia, about the hip, about the spine, about the shoulder, about the neck. And the total available motion might be, how much left, how much right, how much in, how much out. And, I love their work. The selective functional movement assessment, I think, is very detailed on this. And you have to ask, using that framework, then apply it to the sport and the athlete at hand. Is it a large or small, different shaped, hypermobile, hypomobile? There's a lot of lenses to look at, but it really all comes down to, are they making a healthy shape that's appropriately free, and are they strong and powerful and have good capacity in that position? It still comes down to a good shape, which is the absolute essence of kinetic linking. It's how we move, it's how we walk, it's how we generate force. It's like the essence of life is that. Yeah,
I'm glad you brought that up about Greg, because I think that the FMS that's exactly what it was. You launched that kind of in the early 2000s, around 2002, 2003, kind of really started to gain a little bit of popularity and come out. And that's basically what it was. It's like, can you get into shapes? And it was looking at basic shapes of the lower extremity and then basic shapes of the upper extremity, and then putting them together. And then most of the questions are yes or no. Can you do it or can you not? Mm-hmm. And if you can do it, you get a certain score. And if you can't do it, you get a bad score. And if you kind of can do it, you get an in-between score. So he was able to start to quantify movement, which I think was the first model we had of that, that really had the quantification component, which I think is massive and helped get us to this point. I still think it's a great tool, simple tool, very good, and I think it does have a very good movement standard. That was his goal. If you listen to him talk or read his stuff, is really to develop a movement standard, as this is how people move. This is what the minimum acceptable movement quality should be. Those types of things, which he was really adamant about, in the fact that if we don't have a standard of movement, like how can we compare one person to another? If we don't have an objective number, how can we make any progress in this field? So I think that was a tremendous springboard to kind of move upwards from, and I still think it's a phenomenal tool. I think the FMS is really nicely used in team sports. I think the SFMA is a phenomenal tool. We use it every day in the clinic. It's a simple, quick way to screen basically for shapes.
Yep. And I have two stories with Gray Cook. I think, when I met you back in the early 2000s and you told me about Gray Cook, I immediately went online. Gray was wonderful enough to put his whole library of books that he's read online, and I made it a point. I listened to Gray talk once, and I said, I like this man. I like what he has to say. I like how he says it. So I'm going to read all the books that he read. I have a pretty voracious appetite for books, and I like consuming knowledge. And so I just consumed his entire library. And of his entire library, there was one author that really struck gold to me. His name is Pavel Tsatsouline. Sought him out, read all of his books. After reading all of his books, saw that he was the CEO of a company called Strong First. Took all of their courses, read all their material. And Pavel, kind of like the reasons why, kettlebells are even in the West, first was kind of a guru of mobility. And he was a pretty insane mobility specialist. And he said, whatever age you are, that's how many repetitions you should take every joint in your body through full range of motion. Like, oh, that's clever. So if you're like me and you're 44 years old, you need to do 44 shoulder circles one way or 44 going the other way, and do it the same with your elbow, and do the same with your knee, and do the same with your hips. And it was kind of a clever little spin. But my point is, like people brush their teeth, you should be moving your joints and fascia through full range of motion every day. So this is when people ask, how often do I do it? Well, it's your skeleton. I think it's pretty important to take your joint capsules through full range of motion. So does Pavel. Go ahead and do it every day, please, because it's been missing it for the last 15 years. Let's take that hip and rotate it inward.
That's a huge concept. How often should I do it? I love that question. How often should I do this? Well, did you want to make a change, or do you just want to try? Like, what are we trying to do here? And then the people are really hesitant with that. Like, oh, should I do this every day? Yeah, well, yes. Now, if it's a high load, the reason why you wouldn't do something every day, if it's a high load and you're so fatigued that you need a day off to recover, that would indicate don't do it every day. But if it's like just moving around and moving through range of motion, getting mobility, owning positions, owning these certain depths, owning these shapes every day, all 100%.
And we're finding a dysfunction. We're finding the limiting factor for progress in a person's body.
Yeah.
And so, when we talk about what are the regular things you should be doing, you need to be addressing the biggest elephant in the room, which is how your body does this motion. If it's in the motion bucket, it's daily for me. 3 reps or 20 reps. My thing is like, hey, do it 3. If it moves, great. If it doesn't, you have homework to do. Get it by the end of the day.
Yeah.
It's kind of that simple. And a therapy session kind of shows you, after some work, the hip can go 20 degrees. Now, your job is to do this often so it doesn't take so much work to get there. Yeah. And that's really the essence of it. That's simple programming, and you really kind of own the motion bucket through and through. Now, the more posture, bad habits you have, the more homework you have.
That's right.
But that's just life.
Yeah, we every athlete that comes through a KIME and works with any of our team is issued a dynamic warm-up of some form. And this is kind of the purpose of that dynamic warm-up, is to move all the joints through the shapes that are needed at varying speeds. So you start out slow and then you move to more faster speeds. You go from linear to lateral to rotational movements and get exposed to a variety of things. But what we see is that these athletes, they've all done the drills before. They've all done a walking lunge or done like a knee to chest, or they've done a high knee run or whatever it is. And so when we watch them do it, they just kind of dog it, and they just kind of go half-assed. And that's a massive problem, whether it be like kind of a youth athlete up to a veteran athlete or an established athlete. Because I look at the dynamic warm-up not only as a great activation tool, which is proven to be a phenomenal activation tool, but it's also a phenomenal screening tool for you as a person every time you do it. Because every time you do it, if you warm up properly and actually screen yourself and be like, all right, how well is my hip moving forward today? How well is my hip moving sideways today? How well is it rotating? If multiple days in a row, like going lateral, isn't very good for you, well, then spend a little more time on that. Let's get it back to a baseline so you don't, fall off the cliff with it. Like, then is a problem. This is one of the biggest benefits, I think, of fitness for people is that they move. People will claim, well, if I work out all the time, I get hurt. That's probably not so true. You probably are hurt. You just don't move enough to know. Mm-hmm. Is what I think happens more often than not when people get a little bit older and they have these orthopedic kind of knick-knacky injuries, is that they probably have had a problem for a long time, or it was like building. But actually by working out, you exposed it much sooner, which gave you the opportunity to then get it better before it got really worse. Now, if you didn't do that, that was your choice, but it's actually a gift. Mm-hmm. Versus the other person who has been sitting for 20, 30 years, maybe not hurting that much, but then once they kind of actually try to do something, then the whole thing just falls apart. Or they have some sort of massive, deeper issue well beyond an orthopedic one. I'd take an orthopedic problem all day long over some sort of massive, cardiovascular or neurological problem.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
I mean, that can be managed. So I think, look at the shapes that you're using, or that if you're coaching someone that the athlete is trying to get into, what is the desired shapes they have to acquire? And then can they get in the position? So we call this are they efficient? Can they get in the position? Can they own the position? Number one. And then secondly, are they effective? Can they actually get out of the position and use some power or generate force from that position to move forward in a more productive way? And you can apply this to any movement, any direction. And when you look at what's ideal, what you're looking for ideally, and then versus what does the person have today, and then your ability to kind of bridge that gap, bring it together, is really the magic sauce. Thanks for listening to KIMEcast. It's good to have you guys. If you have any comments, something you want to add, please throw it in the comments below. We'd love to interact with you guys that way. If you have any questions for us, you want to submit any questions or do anything on more of a private channel, it's KIMEcast@KIMEperformance.com. Drop us an email and let us know your thoughts. Looking forward to seeing you in the next one.
Thanks.